All right. Hey, everybody. So we are going to be discussing Chapter 8 in this lecture. That's your political parties and interest groups chapter, starting on page 212 for anyone who is following along in the book. So let me get some things pulled up here really fast and we will get that started. Okay. Share my screen with you guys. So I want to make sure that you guys, just as a reminder, hopefully at this point in the semester, this isn't an issue, but just as a review, when you guys are going through the modules that you're checking each of these sections. So, the overview for the week that we have. So of course, the chapter 8 lecture, the chapter 9 lecture, the YouTube playlist, studying for exam 3, because that's next week, reading the chapter 8 and chapter 9 sections in your book, and then the quizzes that you'll have due by the end of this week as well, which I just noticed. Got one little error here. I'll fix that real quick. I can see will be a business. All right. So of course, this is like sort of your general focus for the week for our class. Go back to the modules list here. So, and then of course your readings will be each of the chapters, just like it's listed in the overview. I hope everyone had a good 4th, right? Hopefully everybody had a pretty good time. Of course, the weather was kind of weird, right? And then of course, under the lectures section will be the links to the chapter lectures once they're done, of course. So there's that. And then any notes that I have on things that would help you study. Obviously, I put here, so I kind of give you a breakdown of that. I always pull out the Who Are Americans and Who Participates that are in your book. I always pull out those PDFs for you as well, because those are extra, like they're good supplement information. So there's that. Always jumps on me. Let's see. And then, of course, as usual, your PowerPoints, I've got that listed, as well as the outlines for each PowerPoint. So that way you don't have to necessarily like take notes like while at, or unless you want to, for whatever reason, if you want to, take additional notes, of course, that's fine. But I know for some people, the outline helps so they could just sort of pay attention to the lecture without having to go through and do, quite as much. So that might be a help for you if you're one of those people as well. And then any like videos or anything that I think might be helpful. So I put the YouTube playlist that I have together for everyone. And then like anything kind of extra, like I usually also put the lectures here just kind of as a like extra step, which isn't necessary per se, but in case somebody forgets to look in one area, but they look in another, that way you're sure to have it. One of the things that we'll be talking about when we go over chapter 9 is the Electoral College. So I have a little video for that, but so you'll see like that here, like I'll show it during the lecture, but also if you want to go back and reference it, it'll be there for you as well. And then of course, any assignments, which are just the 2 quizzes for what's due on Sunday. So, so for anybody who needs that. So that is just a quick overview of module 4 and kind of where you're at. But like I said, hopefully you guys are already pretty well familiar with that and that shouldn't be an issue. So Let me stop the share for that. So just wanted to go over that real quick. Now I'm going to share the PowerPoint here with you guys. Maybe it'll cooperate. Okay. Okay, there we go. Got everything set up now. So we're going to jump right into Chapter 8, politics. I'm sorry, political parties and interest groups. So of course, we've talked a little bit about this in the other chapters, right? Like we've touched on things here and there. This just goes into a lot more detail. So individuals can have profound effects on political campaigns, political parties, their elected officials, like we've talked about before. Kelly Carrinder, who's pictured here, took her belief in limited government and her anger over excessive government spending and started the Tea Party movement, which has strongly influenced the direction of the Republican Party. So the Tea Party was a valid, like, third party political group for a while. And then it didn't take very long before it sort of got absorbed into the more conservative segment of the Republican Party. And so a lot of people in the 2010 midterm elections actually got elected as like Tea Party folks, or even like Tea Party Republicans. Like they might not have like changed their political party, but they ran on a lot of the platforms that were resonating with people under the Tea Party. So a lot of the ideals stuck around, but not necessarily the political party itself. The two-party system kind of absorbed it like it does everything else. So this chapter is going to be focusing on a few different things. The first chapter goal is define political parties and their functions in politics. The second one is identify the reasons for and sources of party identification and increased party polarization, which we've discussed a little bit in previous chapters. Describe the history of US party systems and the influence of third parties. Describe major types of interest groups and who they represent. Explain how interest groups try to influence government and policy. So the first chapter goal of define political parties and their functions in politics starts on page 215. So a political party, hopefully you guys all pretty well understand what that means. It's a group, like it's an organized group of people who have similar beliefs and values and how our government should operate. And they all, register as the same political party. And that organized group tries to influence government by electing similar-minded people to office. So, Republicans try to elect other Republicans that fit their agenda. Democrats do the same. So that's their main focus, is to get more people of their beliefs into office, because they believe that like that is the best direction for our government, right? Like that's why they believe the way they do. So that's a political party. And then your book discusses partisanship, which is definitely a political party. Like that is very much focused on like particular leanings. So your book defines partisanship as identification with or support of a particular party or cause. So organize the political world and simplify complex policy debates for citizens and their elected officials. So like packaging it all up in a nice, neat bow and presenting it to the people and saying, hey, here's how we feel. If you agree with us, then come on over. So like we've discussed a little bit before, we definitely are a two-party system. We talked about that at the beginning of the semester. And while we have third parties, none of them make the dent needed to sort of like overtake our two current major political parties. Sorry. So two-party system is a political system in which only two parties have a realistic opportunity to compete effectively for control. So of course that would be the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, right? Should be a surprise to anybody, hopefully, unless you're like living under a rock, like you should be familiar with that. And we'll talk about some of the third party candidates later on in the chapter, and third parties. Actually, we'll talk about the minor parties as well. And it varies from state to state. It varies from election to election, because a lot of people won't stay with like a minor party. It'll come and go. And every state has different requirements, but like Florida requires like so many people to be registered under a minor party for it to be considered a valid active political party. And so that changes all the time as to what people choose to list as to like what minor parties are a valid party to register as. I apologize. I don't know what it is about getting on here and lecturing. Like I have not been yawning at all. And then like get on here to start talking, and then I'm like boring myself. I'm like, oh, I'm so tired. Is it time for bed? I don't know what the deal is. I'm so sorry. I think some of it is like trying to stay honed in on the right topic and not like go squirrel. And like my brain is like, I can't just focus on one thing. So I apologize if I make you guys incredibly tired with the yawning. I'd like to say it's better like physically in class, but I have like a lot of like breathing issues. Like I have sleep apnea and I have asthma and stuff. So like I find myself yawning at just awful times to try and get more airflow in. So unfortunately, because I teach at night, like that is, that happens in the classroom too. I try to make up for it with, witty banter and like, hopefully making it interesting to keep you engaged in spite of my incessant yawning due to poor health. So I apologize for those of you who like that really is distracting. I wish I could change it, but as you can see, it's not really an option. So I'm so sorry. So one of the biggest things that the political parties do is to try and get people to run for office so they can therefore elect more of their people to office, right? Like that's the whole point of the political party system. So that's sort of like their first focus, right, is to recruit candidates. The leaders of the political parties especially are always kind of on the lookout for people in the community who would make for excellent candidates who have a passion and a drive and line up with that political party's like values and goals, and then they try to recruit them. So ideally, like your book says that there are a couple different things that make someone like a good candidate. One of those is experience in running and holding public office. So ideally someone who is like familiar with the political game and they're not like just wet behind the ears and have never done anything. Not that that can't be done. As we saw, Donald Trump had zero experience actually being an elected official and went right to president. That doesn't mean that he was wet behind the ears as far as political experience. He has like donated to a plethora of campaigns. He has been very influential donor over the years to different candidates on both sides of the aisle, mind you. If you look it up, there are like photos of him and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton like being all chummy because he's donated money to them before they ran against each other. So that's politics. So but he had never held like political office. So now generally what people do is they start out like on a smaller scale, whether it be a city position or county or maybe even like a state representative, because that's just over like a district. So it's not like it's a whole statewide something, like you're just over like your little area. Um, so a lot of people start out at those positions and then work their way up. Now, and again, that's not always the case. Sometimes people do well and start out like running straight for Congress, because that again is just like a regional position of a portion of your state. So if you're well known, it's not as difficult to get elected to the House of Representatives as, say, US Senate, because that's the entire state. But so people generally start out on those levels. And in addition to having either experience holding public office, or at least like involved in the political game and kind of know what they're doing and knows the ins and outs, they need to be able to raise money. Now, this is very difficult to do because a lot of people are not comfortable with asking for money. If you cannot ask people for a check to support you, do not run for office. It's so important to, like if you don't have funds, you can't do anything, right? You can't hire staff, you can't send out mail pieces, you can't run like TV spots, like you can't do anything. So it's very important that you need to be able to raise money to one, be seen as a serious candidate, because if nobody's willing to cut you a check, why would anybody be willing to vote for you? Like, you don't have anybody in your life who supports you enough to cut you, like give you like $25, $50. What, like you ain't got some cousin somewhere that can give you $100 who thinks you're awesome, right? Like if you can't get any kind of backing, then you're not going to be seen as a serious candidate. So when you're raising funds as a candidate, you start out like in your immediate circle. So like your family, right? Like your mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters, your like immediate folks, and you tap them out for money. And then you move out in your family tree until you've kind of hit everybody. And you do the same thing with your group of friends, right? Until now you don't know anybody to like bother for money. Now you've got to start hitting cold calls and calling like say dedicated Democrats, if you're a Democrat running, like people who are gung-ho, super voters who vote in every election, and they've donated to Democratic candidates before. Then like you get on the phone with them and be like, hey, I saw that you gave Joe, $500 when he was running for such and such, and that you vote in every election, and you're part of the Democratic committee in town, and like, we need your help. Can I count on you for $500 or whatever, right? So if you can't bring yourself to make that hard ask, which is what that's known as, is the hard ask, then you're not going to make it as a candidate. Like, it's sort of the ugly part of being in politics, really, that a lot of candidates are very uncomfortable with. It takes a while for them to kind of overcome that, which is why they recommend starting out with like your immediate family, your immediate friends, people you would be comfortable with having those conversations with before you get on the phone and start asking strangers who you have never interacted with before. So it's really difficult to get people to run for office, especially at local levels, for a couple of different reasons. So one of those is it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. You've got to find people who don't mind their business being out there, because opposition, things get ugly in a campaign. Like, you can say, I want to run a clean campaign. The other person can say they'll run a clean campaign, but somebody ends up breaking down. Somebody gets desperate. Somebody puts something ugly out there. And the opposition has got to like match blow for blow. Or somebody else in your campaign does something like maybe you as the candidate aren't comfortable with, but it still gets out there, and then it's a thing, right? So you have to be comfortable with whatever might be out there about you, possibly being like public knowledge. So like if you've ever had a driving ticket, if you've ever had a DUI, if you have ever like if you're related to somebody who like has a legal background, like a legal history, they've got, they're a felon or something and they're a close family member, your partner, your whatever. Um, those things end up being fodder when it comes to political campaigns and get used against you. And so it's almost impossible to find someone with a squeaky clean history, right? Like where they don't have anything, nobody that they're close with has anything. Like everybody's got some kind of dirty laundry somewhere, right? Like you're just not going to find somebody who like has had, just the perfect life with no kind of ugliness about it. So you have to be ready and willing as a candidate to have your life exposed, really. And a lot of people are not comfortable with that, especially if there are some skeletons in the closet that could, tear everything apart. And people have to be comfortable in the spotlight too. Like to be a candidate, like everybody's in your business, everybody's in your face. Like you've got to be comfortable at some point with the media, with, interviews, with talking to voters, to going to town hall meetings. I mean, like you name it, like knocking on doors, like you've got to be comfortable, like being a people person, like to the like utmost, right? Or at least faking it really well. Like there are so many different factors that come into play with somebody deciding to run for office that it makes it very hard to talk someone into it. I've been asked before over the years to run for like local offices, and I'm poor. And so I don't have money to devote to my own campaign, which makes it difficult because usually people kind of want to see that you've got a little faith in yourself to cut a little check. And two, like I have a big family, ain't everybody squeaky clean, right? So that makes it difficult, right? And then you have to be willing to sort of put all that out there. And so it's very difficult for a lot of people to make that call. And most people are just not comfortable with going to that level of just kind of raw being out there for everybody to see. So political parties have trouble recruiting folks because of that. So, okay, so the next thing your book starts talking about is how political parties operate and how they're organized. So, which feels a little jumpy, right? Like they're going straight from recruiting people to like, and this is how we're organized, like, but I didn't write the book. So political parties definitely focus on like being the voice for quite a lot of people. Like they channel, like your book says, they channel many voices, right? They speak on behalf of everybody who sort of gets behind that party platform. So they have to really have their stuff together to do well at that, right? So they have to be very organized. There are a lot of checks and balances that have to be done at all levels of political parties to be properly structured, to run like a well-oiled machine. So the definition of a party organization is the formal structure of a political party, including its leadership, election committees, active members, and paid staff. They're usually called committees, and they exist at every level of government. So starting at the top down, at the federal level, there's the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, and they run the day-to-day affairs of the parties at like the top level. And then they sort of set the tone for how it trickles down through the states and the counties and et cetera. So they give candidates, of course, of their same party, like Republicans aren't donating to Democrats and vice versa, for their campaigns to help them run. It can influence who wins primaries as well, because remember, primaries, depending on the state, like Florida, we're a closed primary state. So that gets kind of like tricky, right? Like, because, okay, multiple people of the same party are running, like, and then when the political party like formally backs one particular person, like it's very tricky business, and it has to be done very tactfully, very politically, very carefully. And so they also try to limit disputes within the party and try to keep like a unified front, and um, cut things off at the pass before stuff gets ugly in the public. If they're like, two candidates and the political party is kind of split on them, they might try and like meet with those political candidates, see if they can't come to some kind of arrangement, like maybe they run on the same ticket, maybe one person drops out and backs the other person. Like those are all conversations, like if you remember during the 2020 election, because Donald Trump was already elected, he was the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party. That's usually how it works. Like whoever's in office and is the incumbent is generally who the party backs for reelection, unless they break away, which doesn't happen very often. There was talk about it for the 2020 election, but they ended up backing Donald Trump. But there were a ton of people in the Democratic Party field. I mean, oh my goodness, I can't even think of everybody's names, but there's Pete Buttigieg, who now has a position within Biden's cabinet. Obviously Biden and Elizabeth Warren and there are so many, I can't even like off the top. Oh, and of course Kamala Harris, like she was running at the time. It was a very large field. I think at one time there were 15 or 16 people. It was a lot. And so then at the beginning, it's a lot of people on the ballot, and then people drop out as they start realizing, okay, I just don't have the backing. And then they start supporting other candidates that are still in the race. And some of that is behind closed doors with the political parties as well. Like they will come to Jesus meeting with them sometimes and say, okay, listen, the numbers are not there. The money's not there for you this time. Like, back this person, support them. Like we can make sure that your political career doesn't end here. We can back you for other things. You can always run later. Like, there are things that can be done to, make sure that you don't just disappear if you drop out. But there's no way in Hades you're going to be the person who gets nominated. So, like, take a knee, right? Take one for the team. So those sort of things happen behind closed doors with the political parties. And then the same sort of structure happens at the state level and then also at the county level. So every 4 years, there is a national convention where after the states have had their political primaries for president, and there's pretty well already a nominee, like they have a national convention, delegates chosen throughout the states who are of the same political party go to the convention, and they like cast votes, like confirming like, yes, this person has this many electoral votes based on the presidential primary, not electoral votes, but like they won our state's like primaries. So Florida is casting their ballot for X or whatever is, and so then they like formally announce to their party and basically to the country, this is our guy or gal. This is our person who's going to run for office in this particular election. And both political parties do that, and it's every 4 years at the national level. And then of course they're like constantly working around the clock, like there's no off time for political parties. And then the states have it every 2 years, and it's the like because there are midterm elections that are obviously like a big deal too for states. Like it matters a lot for states. So every 2 years during basically election year, every 2 even years, so 2020, 2022, 2024, et cetera, they hold a state convention, kind of not exactly doing the same thing, but they tout different candidates are out there, like the candidates all across the state come together and kind of talk about their platforms. And it's a great time for kind of the people who are in the know in the political parties to attend these conventions and get one-on-one time with candidates that they wouldn't normally get one-on-one time with, go to hear speeches about like issues that matter to the political party platform and to the original, like to the actual people in the political party who are really involved at the committee level, who are like more than just super voters, but like they like believe in their political party cause enough to where like they're an active member of the party, not just a voter. And so they help register voters, they help recruit candidates, they help raise funds, all of those things. Like they're like the next level. And so they'll be at these conventions, they'll have, you know, breakout sessions for like effective ways to register people to vote, how to utilize social media for, you know, for your political parties and for campaigns that you might work on. And, oh, are you interested in running for office? Here's how you can get the support of the political party. And then they have like a big, you know, state dinner and stuff. And it's just, it's usually like a 3-day thing. And both political parties do it. I know, I want to say both of them here in Florida meet in Orlando, but it might be one in Orlando, one in Tampa. I would have to Google that. I'm not sure. And then the counties a lot of times have county like committees. That's not always the case. A lot of it depends on how active the political party is at that level. Like if you're in a really liberal area, you might not have a Republican committee. If you're in a really conservative area, you might not have a Democratic committee. So it all depends on like how active that party is and how much the people are willing to like put together an organization if they're the minority. So, oh gracious. Sometimes they do county conventions, not always. Obviously a lot less formal than what you have at the state and the national committees. But they, again, they register voters, they volunteer for candidates, they help recruit candidates, they help get people's names out there, the issues that matter, you know, they're a reflection of like the rest of the party. And so it's all, you know, working down into the grassroots level to reach out to as many people as they can about their political platform. So a lot of people think that political parties and the policy agenda that gets put out by their candidates or their elected officials are the exact same. And that's not entirely true. It's not entirely not true either. But so according to your book, political parties differ substantially. Let me see, what page are we on before I start rambling into that? So the figure that was on the previous page or on the previous slide was on 218. So that's where we are now. So we are talking about, so now we're going to talk about policy a little bit and what each political party prefers for policy issues. So each political party is vastly different on policies that they care about, okay? And that shows with the agendas that they put out and what they focus on when each party is in political power, whether it be in the White House or in Congress, you know, whether it be just half of Congress with the House or the Senate, or if it's both. And you can see what like their focus is based on like what it is that they're trying to do while they're in power. So Democrats, for example, focus on policy issues like expanding education and social services funding, health insurance systems on like a national level, kind of like what Canada and like the UK and Australia have, increasing business regulations for things like climate change to try and make sure that there's not like a lot of polluting happening from different businesses and organizations. And they focus on legalized abortion, which, as we know, has been a hot topic in the news. Joe Biden actually just signed two big executive orders, one for gun safety measures, like he signed the gun safety bill that Congress passed into legislation. And then he also put forward an executive order on protecting a right for abortion based on like there are different types of abortion. Like one is by like medicinal use, just by like taking a pill to like stop the process. And it protects that. And then it tries to enhance other protections and is sort of a signal from the administration to try and push the states to also do the same. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, what the pushback will be. And there will be pushback from some of the states and from some of the elected officials and the people who support it. It'll be interesting to see the divide and see it all burn down, see how each person reacts. And like there's just doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground between the parties lately. And then Republicans prefer less spending on social programs and healthcare programs because they're for smaller government, less taxes, protecting gun owners' rights, and opposing abortion. So as you can see, complete opposite. Like getting like especially elected official Democrats and Republicans or political party leader Democrat and Republicans, like getting them to agree on anything, like hell would freeze over. Like it just like doesn't happen. You might be able to get like the average Democrat and Republican to agree on some stuff, like who aren't so entrenched in all of the issues. But like the people who are really engaged in the process, like it's usually a pretty large divide actually. So but it's not just between Democrats and Republicans. There are actually factions within each political party as well, because it can't be simple, right? Like it has to be complicated, of course. So, you know, that's just how our political system works. So we're going to talk about party factions now. So in addition to having like the party divide between different parties, there are also what you would call factions within political parties. So I don't believe your book defines factions, but hopefully you guys can kind of gather what that is or already know what that is. So Republicans sort of infight, I guess you could say, over different issues between people who are conservatives because they're pro-business, or if they're far-right populists, or social and religious conservatives, or libertarians, which we had talked about before in previous chapters about they just want like very little to no like government interference. And a lot of people will agree with the libertarian platform, but maybe register as Republicans so they have more say in the political process and more on their ballot, especially if they're in a closed primary state. So those are sort of like different segments of the Republican Party. And then for Democrats, you've got people who are like traditional Democrats, and they're kind of they're a little more old school, like they believe in the party platform, but they don't rock the boat as much as maybe like the far left would. And then you have like your moderate Democrats. You also have your moderate Republicans, of course. And then you have the progressive section, which is your definitely more left leaning, very liberal thought processes. So there ends up being, I guess, what you would call like infighting among the parties on the different segments of the political parties as to where the leaders feel like the party should head, like what direction should it go in on different policy agenda items. So we definitely talked about party identification in one of the previous chapters, but we're going to talk about it some more. So for those of you following along on the book, we're on page 220 with party identification guides voters. So the chapter goal we're focusing on now is identify the reasons for and sources of party identification and reasons for increased party polarization. So that's our second chapter goal. So your party identification is what your personal beliefs and values, your personal feelings on the way the country ought to run and how it should be set up. And that is what links you to one particular party or the other. Based on your personal viewpoints, you're likely to choose, party A versus party B, because your personal beliefs line up psychologically with that of that political party. So, and then your, a lot of those attachments form when you're younger. Your parents can hand that down to you, your grandparents, whoever is sort of like an important figure in your life that you would look up to, that you would pay attention to their belief systems. Not to mention all of the other factors that we had talked about with political socializations in the previous chapters, about, like your family ties, your friends, your social groups, your education, all of those things factor into how you choose a political party. A lot of people who, bleed blue or bleed red and they, they're very, Democrat or very Republican or whatever, a lot of them might choose to do more than just vote, and they become really engaged in the political process on a different level and start being more active within their own political party. So your book defines those as party activists, which are partisans who contribute time, energy, and effort to support their party and its candidates. So okay, you guys saw a pretty similar poll to this in one of the previous chapters. So I'm not gonna, go through the why you see the shift again. But if I remember correctly, something before I skim through it, maybe I'm missing. Yes. In page 6, public opinion, you can see it's very similar with like the American ideology figure. See right there, you can see a little bit. It's kind of similar to that. So, but it shows different. It shows people who identify as one party or the other. So this is a little bit different. It shows the Democrat kind of going down at the 80s when we had like kind of the Reagan era, and then it kind of levels off. And then the Republicans took a dive right before that during the 70s, and then came up in the Reagan era, kind of leveled off, and then dipped down again during the latter portions of like the Iraq War and stuff, like during the Obama era, like after Iraq, after the election of Obama from Bush, after he served his terms, and then a slight increase during, Trump's tenure. And then the independents have sort of stayed in the middle, but also come up just a little bit. And that kind of wavers, and a lot of it depends on what's happening in the political process, what's going on in the news, like just kind of the state of the world. And yeah, so it shifts a little bit. Oh, gracious. Sorry. Okay, so we've already talked about this section quite a bit in the previous chapter, so I'll just like quickly review, but I won't bore you guys with going over and all the same sort of examples and details. So different social groups, like we talked about before, your political socialization determines sort of how you choose political parties. African Americans, women tend to be more Democrat. Non-Hispanic whites tend to be more Republican, especially without a college degree. Latino voters are very split with a slight edge for Democrats. Men in general favor Republicans slightly more. So that's kind of a summary of like, we won't go into all of the details on the same levels we did in the previous chapters. So members of racial and ethnic minority groups tend to favor Democratic candidates. In 2020, Joe Biden gained support from African Americans, for example. So we didn't talk quite as much about this in the previous chapters, but we have touched on the religion aspect. People who are in a more traditional, like conservative thought process and viewpoints in their religion are more likely to identify as Republicans, such as Protestants, and people who are of the Jewish faith or maybe even unaffiliated with a religion at all, atheists, agnostics, et cetera, are more likely to identify as Democrat. People don't like to believe that we have a class system in this country, but we absolutely do. We're very much a system of the haves and have-nots. We have low class, middle class, upper middle class, and it very much does draw lines in the sand on people's political views. So Republicans tend to have a lot of wealthy economic interests in mind, the lower taxes, smaller government, pro-business aspect, where Democrats represent people who are less affluent, lower societal status. But a lot of social issues complicate that. So even though like the working class is of the less affluent Americans, they tend to favor Republicans. And then you see like wealthy celebrities or wealthy minorities, and they tend to favor Democrats. So a lot of it also depends on, like if somebody is passionate about a social issue more than anything else, then they'll follow the political party that lines up with that viewpoint or their own personal experiences. And so that's something to keep in mind. Like I talked about before, it's not just, okay, here are all the criteria, and if you check off more boxes here than you do over here, then you're this party. It's not quite that black and white. Where you live is, this is of course a generalization, but just to give kind of a general idea. So Democrats tend to be more on the coastlines, so the upper Midwest, large cities, California, New York, like the coastal areas. Republicans tend to be more in like the Mountain West area, like the middle of the country and the Great Plains, like Kansas, that kind of thing. And of course in the South and in more suburban and rural areas. So that's not a surprise if you've ever paid attention to an election, because that's how it always works out. Like you look at the 2020 election, like Atlanta was very blue, but then like all the surrounding areas to Atlanta were very red, blue for Democrat, red for Republican. So, and then age, we've talked about that before. Younger voters tend to favor Democrats, older voters tend to favor Republicans. There are a lot of theories behind that. A lot of it is, I won't even go into all the theories, but there are a lot of different ideas behind why younger voters versus older voters and how they tend to vote. So this is a good visual for you guys who votes in primaries and caucuses. So the 2020 primary elections, let's see, this is on page 225. So it says during presidential primary elections, early primaries and caucuses have important impacts on who the party's nominee will be. Despite this effort, voter turnout in primary elections is still really low, even in states with early contests like Iowa and New Hampshire, who are like the first people to vote in the presidential preference primary elections. And current years, a lot of states have turned away from caucuses, which require voters to attend events in person, and instituted primaries instead in an attempt to increase voter turnout, because then you have the option for early voting, vote by mail, that kind of thing, as opposed to a caucus where you've got to like physically be there a certain day, certain time. It makes it a lot harder for successful voter turnout in those areas. So you'll see based on color, like the red areas, very, very low turnout. Alaska, that sounds right because it's cold, right? It's super, super cold. And all the primaries are like at the beginning of the year, you know, like right after the holidays. So they're like, I'm not getting out and going to vote. I'm so sorry for you. It is way, way too cold. I don't know what Hawaii's deal is. Hawaii's got perfect weather all the doggone time, speaking from having visited there. So I don't know why they don't show up. And then I'm not even gonna lie, I couldn't tell you which every single state is. Was this Kansas, I think? Sorry, I'm not really, I honestly don't know. I don't have them all. I ain't teaching you geography, so I can never remember like kind of like the Midwest states, like exactly which one is which. So these two are very low turnout. And then New York, which is really interesting to me because like New York is such an important state by the end of it all with the electoral college, but I guess in the presidential preference, they don't care. So I don't know. Let's see, lighter orange, Florida, Louisiana, Idaho, Tennessee, South Carolina. Is that right? South Carolina. New Arizona? No. New Mexico? Sorry, guys. Anyways, all of those are still pretty low turnout. So I'm disappointed in Florida, but I'm also not surprised because we do those things. A lot of the states kind of like a little bit more turnout in that 20 to 30% range. These light blue states, they've got it going on as far as like pushing for high turnout. You know, California, Alabama, Georgia. Alabama and Georgia should never be outranking Florida. For those of you who are from here, you know that there's definitely a tri-state like competition for being like the best in the tri-state southern area right here. And if you don't, now you know. So there's always like we're certainly better than those other two states, right? Like Alabama does it to Georgia and Florida, Georgia does it to Alabama and Florida, Florida does it to Alabama and Georgia. And so I'm kind of mad at this number. I'm frustrated that the two of them had better turnout than us in the presidential preference primary. I want to go smack around some voters. And then let's see. And then in the green, like those are the 40 to 46%. So very few states are at that level, right? Like we've got right up here in the very northwest, got New Hampshire because they're the very first presidential preference primary. So like there's a state pride in that with New Hampshire. They take it very seriously that they're the first presidential preference. Like all the candidates have to go through there and they all make a stop and they don't skip it. And it's like an imperative for you to do well in New Hampshire. A lot of people drop out right after New Hampshire because like if you bomb in New Hampshire, a lot of times it's an indicator for how you're going to do with the rest of the states. So there you go. So they always make a big deal about turning out because they don't want, because they feel like they set the pace. Like they're the first ones, they're saying, y'all need to turn out. I will also say this is disappointing. Not one state had over 50% voter turnout in the presidential preference primary. That is typical in a primary, but it's really sad. I wish like the numbers were always, 50 plus, 75% plus. Like I wish people understood how invaluable voting is and how unbelievably lucky we are to be born in a country where we can do that. Because it really is just the luck of the draw, that we weren't, born in a country that represses that. So that's my little high horse moment for the night. So, and then you'll see here, so this is primary elections, so definitely a higher turnout. And then you see here, these three are the ones who do the caucuses instead. So we don't we got 3 states that do caucuses as opposed to primaries, and they're just going away. Like I'm actually surprised that these guys have like held on to it as long as they have. So there's that, like Nevada and Iowa, obviously, and one of the Dakotas, maybe. Sorry. It's not my forte. I could never memorize like where each state went. Like you play that game where it's like, oh, see if you can write down all 50 states or list off all 50 states. I always forget something. And it's usually like a Dakota. It's something with a north and a south, like it's West Virginia, Virginia. Why has it got to be West Virginia and Virginia? Why can't it be North and South Virginia? We got North and South Dakota, North and South Carolina. These are the things that drive me crazy about when things were originally founded. Why don't we just have like a Carolina? Why do we have to have North and South? Why do we just have a Dakota? Why does, like y'all really ran out of names, North and South Dakota? Like you couldn't have come up with something else, like anything else, all the words, and you couldn't come up with a new state name. But anyways, so it's just a little geography pet peeve of mine. So anyways, so these are the only 3 who do caucuses. And as you can see, super low turnout. Nobody wants to go to it. Like people have to work. It's hard for them to just say, okay, I'll come and I'll do like the little town hall meeting thing, raise my hand for who we want, put it in the ballot box or whatever. It's just very old school. Now some people used to do caucuses because it was like in more rural areas. And so, there weren't as many people. It wasn't as big a deal to like have a bunch of like voting locations and stuff. But like Iowa's actually got a pretty good population. Same with Nevada. I want to say Nevada. Like, so they actually have very large areas that would warrant like the primaries being implemented. So we'll see. I'm not really one to like bet. I'm pretty confident like in most of my like gut feelings on things, but I can never get a feel for whether or not these are going to stick around. Like a part of me feels like in my lifetime they'll be gone, but then a part of me goes, oh no, man, Iowa is stubborn. So I don't know, like they might be the last holdout. They like being the first in the caucuses, just like New Hampshire likes that they're first in the primaries. So who knows? But that'll be something for you to keep an eye out for as a voter to see how it goes. It's just sort of a weird, convoluted process from literally everybody else in the country, but states' rights. So it's a little close up for you of the same thing. So, all right, so now we are on page 20. Is that right? 26. So now we are on the next chapter goal, which is describe the history of US party systems and the influence of third parties. So this gets a little convoluted. I don't expect you to know like verbatim every little thing, but I want you to kind of understand how things shifted back and forth. So, okay, describe US party systems and their influence on other third parties. So, so anytime that there's like kind of a large section of history where, okay, there were like 2 major parties and they sort of dominated the political sphere, historians call those party systems. As you can see in figure 8.3 on page 227, it gives you a breakdown of each party system. So party systems can still shift even if it stays the same two parties, because it can change on, like it shows a new party system if social issues changed, if the focus in that political sphere changed, but it's still the same two political parties. So you might see like some crossover with the same like parties, but events in history sort of like shift the dynamics. So we have not always had the same two dominant parties. It has not always been the Democrats and Republicans. It has evolved to them. And they have been around for a hot minute. So we're going to now go through and talk about how all of that shifted. So like the slide says, there have been 6 distinct party systems in US history since we started with political parties, which was after the US Constitution was ratified, after we threw out the Articles of Confederation and redid it, everything. So you guys have certainly heard about Federalists quite a bit. We had a whole chapter on federalism. We talked about Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the founding chapter. So that's the first thing your book talks about. So the first party system is the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Federalists were the same Federalists that were for the Constitution ratification. So your New England merchants, they wanted protective tariffs to be able to protect their businesses and to not kind of get gypped by like bad trade. And they wanted a national bank created. They wanted to take ownership of our economic system and away from Britain, and they wanted to be more independent and set a leading presence in the rest of the world, like that. Like they're standing on their own feet. They're their own nation, their own entity, separate from Britain, and basically set up a system to be able to work with other countries as well. So the Anti-Federalists, who ended up that kind of group of people, became what was known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. So they were in support of Southern farmers. So as you can see, North versus South, we've already got that division. They wanted free trade and states' rights, right? Because they wanted small government, not larger government. And they wanted to have a closer relationship with France they wanted to pull away from Britain more. They wanted to start developing relationships outside of being like a colony, even more so than the Federalists did. They kind of wanted to like just put it behind and be like, okay, let's just move on, do our thing. And the Anti-Federalists were like, no, like we have not forgotten how it worked with Britain. And so we want to like distance ourselves as much as we can. So this is on page 227. Let me zoom in for you guys. So as you can see, we have the Federalists formed just slightly before the Jeffersonian Republicans, also known as Democratic Republicans. So the reason why it was shortly after the Federalists is because it was that whole Federalist, Anti-Federalist thing, but the Anti-Federalists weren't like organized as an actual political party yet. So they emerged like slightly after. So, and when they say Jeffersonian Republicans, they're talking about Thomas Jefferson. So your book talks about that. Let's see. So the Federalists also wanted to forgive Revolutionary War debts from the states. When Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in 1800, so John Adams was the Federalist president, and then Thomas Jefferson was the Jeffersonian a Republican candidate, and he defeated John Adams. The Federalists started to grow weaker. So from like 1788, 1790, the Federalists are like top dogs. And then John Adams is, you know, is president after George Washington, of course. And then Thomas Jefferson beats him. Federalists start growing weaker, and the party pretty much disappeared after pro-British sympathies of some Federalist leaders during the War of 1812 led to charges of treason against the Federalist Party. So from the collapse of the Federalists until the 1830s, America only had one political party. That was Jeffersonian Republicans. So you see here, that little green gap to the red, like right there. So for just a smidge of time, it was just the Jeffersonian Republicans. And they gradually became known as the Democrats, which is interesting, right? Like, so it's like, wait a minute, like, where'd the Republican word go, right? So they started calling themselves Democrats. The party experienced a lot of internal conflict between supporters and opponents of General Andrew Jackson, America's great hero of the War of 1812. He was the first populist president and had a wide base of support. He sought to give rank and file members more say in political parties through national conventions. So like reward those people who like were loyalists to the party. They did deny him the presidency in 1824. He won it in 1828 and 1832. And his support was mostly in the South and Midwest, and he generally favored policies that appealed to those regions, including free trade, because that was who supported him. So not really a president for the people, right? Just for the people who supported him and liked him. So that's like kind of going into the second system. So we have Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. That's your first system, right? And then Federalists sort of fall apart, and then it's just Jeffersonian Republicans. And then they change their name up to the Democrats, and they end up electing Jackson. So, and then this group, the National Republicans, come along. Now, this is always been confusing and ridiculous to me that the Jeffersonian Republicans didn't keep the Republican name. They switched over to the word Democrat, and then now this group called the National Republicans pops up. It's like, really? Like, y'all just trying to mess with everybody. Like, y'all knew people were going to be reading about this in history later going, what, wait, what, who? So it makes it very difficult to keep up with. So, but if you were to see a question that said, who made up the first political party system, for example, ooh, that was weird. Okay, hold on, let me make sure that I don't have any issues. That was weird, like my thing went screwy all of a sudden, sorry. Okay, let me go back and fix this here. Uh-oh. What are you doing, computer? Hold on a second, guys. I think my computer's getting a little overheated. I'm trying to make sure the fans are getting plenty of air here. Woo! Stay. Sorry, trying to make sure. I think that's what happened when I was doing the last video. I think it kept getting overheated and like shutting down. And ain't nobody got time for that. Like, get it together, computer, right? So, okay, so if you were to see who made up the first political party system, you would answer Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, right? Right? Like if you were to see it on like a test of some kind, like that would be maybe how you would answer. So, okay, so then we have, hold on just a second. Hey, Google, lower bedroom light by 10%. Or not. I hate like Google's automatic system. Like I think like my computer's getting hot because the light's too bright and I can never get it to lower right. I don't know how to do the right thing. My husband always gets it and I get annoyed. So give me just a second. Let me see if I can get this fixed. I got it, guys. I got it to lower. I had to pause the recording so I could so Google and I could have a real conversation apparently. So hopefully that will help keep my computer from getting too hot. So ridiculous. Okay, so we've gone through the first political party system, right? Like now the Federalists are gone and the Jeffersonian Republicans are still around, but now they're calling themselves the Democrats because that's not confusing. So the second party system is now the Democrats, formerly known as Jeffersonian Republicans, and this group called the Whigs. So National Republicans don't stay very long at all. So during the 1830s, groups who weren't a fan of Jackson formed the Whig Party. Okay, so again, Andrew Jackson is the Democrat president. So people who are like, I don't like him. I don't like the fact that he's just favoring like the South and the Midwest because they like him. So like, we're going to come over here and create our own party. And that's the Whig Party. So, so both Democrats and Whigs built party organizations throughout the nation to enlarge their base. The Northeast support for Whigs was stronger than in the South, right? So the Whigs were basically the successors, like by default to the Federalists, just because of how the country divided into factions of like which political party they were for. So the Whigs would be like the next ones after the Federalists. So they won their first presidential election in 1840 with General William Henry Harrison, but they avoided a lot of issues because the party couldn't agree on any. They just knew they did not like Andrew Jackson. And so they were basically created to say down with Jackson more than anything else. So, and they invested a lot in rallies and entertainment to win the hearts, if not the minds of voters. So they went for like the emotional factor more than like the logic factor. So conflicts over slavery produced sharp division within both of the parties, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. By 1856, the Whig Party basically disintegrated under the strain of it because they didn't really have anything that they were standing for, just the one thing they were standing against, which was Jackson. So a lot of Whig politicians and voters, along with anti-slavery Democrats, ended up joining the new Republican Party, as you see right here in the 1850s, which pledged to ban slavery from the Western territories. So basically no new slavery in like new areas. In 1860, the Republicans nominated Lincoln for the presidency. Lincoln's victory in a four-way candidate race was less than 40% of the popular vote, strengthened Southern calls for secession from the Union, and soon after we had the Civil War. So now we have gotten through our second party, right? So our first party system, Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Federalists fizzle out. Jefferson Republicans become top dog and then they change their name to Democrats. Your book doesn't even really talk about National Republicans because they go by the wayside pretty fast. Whigs pop up. And so now this is kind of like the second party system, the Democrats and the Whigs. So then the Whigs kind of fall apart because they don't have any policy issues. They don't have a political platform. They just hated Jackson. So then people from the Jeffersonian Republicans, now known as the Democrats, who were not for slavery, and some other issues that they did not agree with on and formerly the anti-federalist side. Remember, this is all anti-federalist backing, and anti-federalists were for states' rights, for slavery, because a lot of them were in the South, the farmers, et cetera, right? So keep that kind of like history timeline in your mind, and it'll make it easier to know who's who. So them and then like Whigs from that group who are also anti-slavery kind of joined forces and created the Republican Party. Of course, we still have the Democrats. If you notice, the Democrats stick around, but not in the way you think. So we now have Democrats and Republicans, but not modern day Democrats and Republicans. So then we have the Civil War happen. So that's going to be what your book refers to as like the third party system or the Civil War party system. So Lincoln depended heavily on Republican governors and state legislators for troops, funding, popular support for the war, basically. The secession of the South had stripped the Democratic Party of many of its supporters because, so, okay, you got to think the Democrat and Republicans are for the Union, for the United States. But now the South has said that they've seceded from the Union. So now we've got the Confederacy. So those Democrats, like some of those Democrats are now, they've decided to be part of the Confederacy. So now the Democratic Party at the time is weakened because part of their people are now not part of the country. So, so that kind of weakens that party and gives more strength to the Republican Party at the time. So they did, however, remain politically competitive throughout the war, and they almost won the 1864 election, but Lincoln was able to win re-election. With the defeat of the Confederacy in 65, Republicans granted the right to vote to newly freed enslaved people, which we've talked about, thus creating a large pro-Republican voting bloc. So all of these recently freed slaves who had the right to vote, who are they voting for? The people who freed them, right? So that would be the Republican Party. So voting rights for Blacks failed, however, because of violent resistance by Southern whites and the KKK, of course. Former Confederate states regained full control of their internal affairs and party politics. Throughout the South, African Americans were deprived of political rights, which we've talked about in the civil liberties and civil rights. So from the end of the Civil War to the 1890s, the Republican Party remained the main party of the North with strong business and middle class support. And the Democrats were pretty much the party of the South and of farmers with support of some Northern working class and immigrant groups. So, so are you guys starting to see a pattern that like in the division of the parties and what comes next? So that was the third party system, Civil War. Now we come to what they call the system of 1896, populism and Republican responses. So, so we're down here. Okay, so prohibition, 1892 populists. So we're right here. So we still have the Democrats, still got the Republicans, but they kind of switch over into like this sort of focus. So a lot of social and economic change happened during the 1890s. There were some third parties that popped up, which are these right here. So the Populist Party, who actually won support in the South and West. So that weakens the Democrats. That kind of splits them out a little bit, just like the Civil War did. So they mainly appealed to small farmers, but also attracted Western miners and urban workers. In the 1892 elections, the Populist Party carried 4 states in the presidential race and elected governors in 8. They effectively merged with the Democrats, though, who nominated William Jennings Bryan for presidency. The Republicans nominated conservative Senator William McKinley. So, so the Democrats still existed when the populist movement came up, but the populist movement is sort of like what we were talking about with the Tea Party movement at the beginning of the chapter. It's kind of a short-lived, like third party political movement. And then they kind of merge in with like a larger political entity, just like the Tea Party did with the Republican Party, right? So now it's just sort of like a faction of the Democratic Party. It's the populists align more with that than with the Republicans. So they like kind of merge into that and then they go away as their own entity, just like the Tea Party did. So let's see, Northern and Midwestern business interests made in an effort to defeat what they saw as a radical threat from populist Democratic alliances, and Republicans won, advocating for lower taxes and high tariffs on imports. They carried the more heavily populated North and confined the Democrats to their small bases of support in the South and far West. For the next 36 years, the Republicans remained the nation's majority party, winning 7 of 9 presidential elections and majorities in both of the houses of Congress in 15 of 18 races. The Republicans favored government regulation, expanded voting rights, and the creation of the national bureaucracy to professionalize the work of government. So all is well until the Great Depression. So the Republican Party is like top dog. So it was Democrats, right? For a little bit, we had a little bit of Democratic time. And then the Republicans lead the charge. But what ends up happening is all ish hits the fan when we have like the crash of 1920s and like where, you know, the current government is simply not equipped to handle it. So so let's see, that puts us at, so now we're at the fifth party system. So this is right before we get to the modern system that we know today. So the New Deal party system, that's the fifth one. Government helps the working class. So Herbert Hoover won in the Republican Party the presidential election of 1928. Now, this is a lot like what happened to George Bush. You know, George Bush was elected, and then like within like what the first year of his presidency, 9/11 happened, and that defined his presidency. And that is what is going to happen to Herbert Hoover when the stock market crashed and we end up in the Great Depression. He really got screwed. Like it's just kind of like the terrible luck of the draw. The nation's economy basically collapsed. So there are a variety of different issues that caused the Great Depression, high tariffs on imports, for example, and people not being able to pay that effectively. The Republican Party basically did not do enough to promote economic recovery and relief when up to a fourth of American workers were without jobs and millions were actually starving in the streets. So, I mean, there were literally people like dying in the streets because they didn't have money and there was no system designed to help those people, like literally just not die from not being able to work. So, which you can't even imagine now, right? Because of all the social programs we have in place. But we didn't have that until all of this was happening in the Great Depression. So Herbert Hoover kept pushing states' rights because that was what we were built on, right? Smaller government, states to handle it, but the states' individual economic systems and their individual rules and regulations were not enough to handle what was becoming a national crisis. And the federal government had to deal with something quite like that, where, okay, this isn't just happening in one state, this is happening everywhere. So what are we going to do? Because this is like a trickle effect. And now we're all suffering. And Herbert Hoover kept wanting to stick to like the states are supposed to handle this because that was kind of the setup that we had implemented and wanted, right? The closest thing that he had, which is talked about in more detail in another chapter, and I believe there's a picture somewhere else in your book of it, but Herbert Hoover, during his administration, they had created like these, what they call shanty shack towns, where it's literally like just like a thrown together shack of a home to put the people who were like out on the street to keep them from being out on the street. But I mean, like we like these little like shanty town shack villages were popping up, and they ended up being called Hoovervilles for Herbert Hoover, because that was the only game plan that he had to do something about the problem. He just wasn't equipped to do what needed to be done. And so people were hurting. So in 1932, so again, Hoover is elected in 1928. The crash happened in 1929. So 1932 is when he would run for re-election. People are obviously not happy about what's happening, and the president is the figurehead. So when things go right, they very rarely get credit if they did anything to help, but they certainly get all the blame. And so everybody turned to him going, what the crap, man, you're not doing anything to solve this. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt came along and ran for office against Hoover with the game plan of like, here's how I'm going to fix what is happening in the country. Like he put out a solid plan, and Hoover didn't have a way to like counteract it or like a plan of his own. So the country was like, yeah, we're going to go with the guy with the plan. So peace out. So the 36 years of like Republican leadership was like done at that point because he ran under the Democratic Party because Hoover was a Republican. So like, yeah, he like had to be the opposition, right? So that effectively flips the parties. So because FDR wasn't like what the Democratic Party had been set up as at the time with the like the pro-slavery and all of those things, and smaller government and all, because remember the Republican Party has extended voting rights at this point. They were for like anti-slavery. Those are all like expansions of government power. That's actually like a larger government sort of like platform where the Democrats weren't really doing that. So, but like on a small scale, the Republicans were doing that. And then FDR came in and like flipped the switch and was like, oh, you think that's big government? Yo, 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 look out. So he implemented all these plans under the Democratic Party, which sort of made them the party of like larger government when necessary and for expansion of programs in what the Republicans were doing on a smaller scale. So it sort of flipped the switch, right? So now the Democrats are for all these progressive movements that the Republicans were kind of doing under like Lincoln and stuff. And so now you start to see the switch for what is a modern Democrat and a modern Republican. So, so your book talks about the different things that happen, like with the New Deal. So, and the New Deal made the Democrats like the leading, like party in charge for the next 36 years. So we had like 36 years of Republicans and then 36 years of Democrats. And he also ended up getting a solidly Democratic Congress. So he was able to get a lot done because the Democrats were in charge across the board. So he expanded the base of the political party, rebuilt the party around unionized workers, upper middle class intellectuals and professionals, Southern white farmers, Jews, Catholics, and Northern African Americans. That is still the Democratic Party. He basically tore the script apart from what was the Democratic Party and like rebuilt it in a completely different image. So let's see, Republicans were grasping for a response and often wound up supporting popular New Deal programs like Social Security because it was popular at the time. Even the relatively conservative administration of Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s left the principle of New Deals intact. So it was strained, however, in the 60s. So your book talks about how there were conflicts over civil rights in in Vietnam War. Equal rights for African Americans divided a lot of Northern Democrats who supported it from white Southern Democrats who defended racial segregation. So there's that North and South Civil War attitude rearing its ugly head, right? So what divided us in the Civil War is threatening to divide us again in the 60s. So, so remember before the Whigs and the Democrats came together because they were anti, like, you know, they were like one segment, the Republicans were another segment. And now there's a threat of like factioning off because as this larger government, these social programs come, it just sort of becomes a natural evolution that it's okay, well, now we need to help this group and that group. Like we need to keep expanding this thought process of like not screwing over the little guy and not letting them fall on their face and helping them like have an equal footing. So then that goes to different minority after different minority group. And then there were Democrats who were like, okay, I was all for like fixing the economy and these programs so people aren't starving in the streets, but integration, I don't know. That seems a little much, don't you think? Like, which is ridiculous. So now we have like a division in the Democratic Party between people who are for that and people who are against that. So as the movement launched a Northern campaign aimed at equal access to jobs, education, quality public schools, and housing, Northern Democrats also split along income lines. The Vietnam War further divided the Democrats, with upper income Democrats strongly opposing Lyndon Johnson's decision to expand the number of troops in Asia. These divisions provided an opportunity for the Republican Party, which recaptured the White House in 1968 under the leadership of Richard Nixon. So, let's see, we've gone through all of this. Hold on, let me go back, make sure I didn't miss anything here. Talk about that. Okay. All right. So this image is on page 229. So Richard Nixon's Southern strategy helped broaden the Republican Party's base in the late 1960s and the 1970s, appealing to white Southerners. Here, Nixon meets supporters in Georgia in 1968. So that flipped it back from Democrats to Republicans because they took the opportunity for the Democratic infighting to build like a solid coalition, and they basically targeted the people in the Democratic Party who were not happy with the base wanting to support integration and all of those kinds of things. And so they sort of targeted the disheartened in the Democratic Party and said, come over here, look, like we understand how you feel, like come and vote with us. And and so they did, and that caused a shift where those Democrats changed their political party to Republican as a result of an increasingly conservative South, which you guys, that probably sounds familiar from a question on the quiz. And so that is the reason why you saw that split. It was because of the people whose values, like, they didn't feel like they were lining up with the Democratic Party anymore. They didn't recognize the Democratic Party. Like, they were cool with some of the stuff. They supported FDR and those movements, but they were not comfortable with racial integration. So they didn't stick with the party. They changed their party. So already did that. Okay, so this is where we're at. So now we're at our current system. So contemporary American party system. So that emerged in the 60s, like I just said. Republicans kind of won over white Southerners in that divide. Ronald Reagan added religious conservatives as well, and working class whites to the coalition, who also felt like out of place if they were with the Democratic Party. The religious conservatives wanted, that like less government intervention. They wanted more traditional values reflected in their party. And they felt like they weren't seeing that. So they kind of headed over to the Republican Party. Democrats retained the support of racial minorities, union workers, poor and working class Americans, upper middle class professionals, your intellectual elites, celebrities, that kind of thing. Like, all of those people are still in the like Democrat camp, basically. So let's see. Okay, so Richard Nixon appealed to Southern whites by sending subtle signals of support for their resistance to racial equality, sparking the shift that gave Republicans a strong position in what was the Confederacy. Let's see, Reagan added the religious conservatives who opposed abortion and felt Democrats were not protecting traditional family and religious values. The second was working class whites who were drawn to Reagan's tough approach on foreign policy and opposition to affirmative action. So again, totally opposite of what the Democratic Party was doing. So a lot of Republicans considered Reagan time as the golden era because there's a lot of deregulation of a lot of industries, so a lot of pro-business movement, reduction in government intervention in the economy, which we talked about when we talked about federalism, right? And how like Nixon and then Reagan furthered the movement towards returning more power to the states and less to the federal government, and had a lot of economic growth. So the 65 voting rights movement increased voter participation among Blacks in the South and helped Democrats retain some congressional seats. So, and then you see here, they appealed to Americans for economic fairness, inequality, women's rights, the environment, and other progressive social causes. So these movements, so when the Republican Party, when the Democrats started factioning off, like pro and anti integration, and the Republican Party took that and said, hey, like, we're not really for racial equality either. Come on over here. So that starts furthering the divide and what you start seeing. And then when Reagan added the religious conservatives, then the Democrats respond with like, okay, all right, you're going to go that way. We're going to go this way. So then that's where you start seeing that like increase divide from like middle ground Democrats and Republicans to more liberal conservative and less middle ground. So that these actions are what caused that. And it started a little bit with like the New Deal and FDR getting elected and like the restructuring of the Democratic Party, but it was the only way to like pull the country out of it. So it was sort of like a snowball effect after that. Before FDR, a lot of the political parties were very similar. And it was like, whose personality do you like better? Because we don't have really big different like political issues that we're putting out there. And then when FDR happened, like there were some lines in the sand drawn on solid political goals and policy issues. And so as a result, like the Republican Party kind of like started going the other way after the 60s. Like until then, like the New Deal era was continuing and even Republicans were kind of going along with it. And then when the 60s happened in Vietnam, you start seeing that breaking. So so that is basically how we got our current like super to the left and super to the right system. So it was just really a progression of our history. And a lot of people go, I just don't understand why they can't get along and this, that, and the other. And some of it is because those hard values are very ingrained in both of the political parties. Now, like you probably know Republicans or might be one yourself where it's like, well, I'm not racist. I don't have a problem, like integration, like of course, like because you might not have even been around for that. And like more, maybe you are Republican because your parents are Republican or whatever, or, you know, you're more for, you know, like maybe you're very religious. And so like that appeals to you for more some of those traditional values. And like if you're a Democrat, like maybe you're like, I mean, okay, but like I'm not really hardcore. Like we all have voting rights and stuff. Like I don't see what the big deal is. But it all came before. And like we've talked about before, you know, you've got that political socialization. So some of what you're influenced by to choose Democrat or Republican is based on your family, on how your parents were registered, or your grandparents, or whoever, and what their political views were. Like that gets ingrained in you in a way that you're not even necessarily conscious of. Just as like your own personal life experiences, you know, like even your gender, like, and whether or not you're a minority, like some of those things based on how the country has treated maybe whatever groups you belong to, like if you're African American or you're female or you're LGBTQIA or whatever, depending on how our country's actions have impacted the group that you identify with, that may determine more so what political party you choose than, you know, what grandma was or whatever, right? So so it kind of depends, but that's how we've gotten to where we are today. It sort of became a divide and conquer system, and it still is since the 60s. So there we are. So um, so like you saw with like the Populist Party, we've had a little bit in the way of third parties early on, but not much, right? Like, and they don't last very long, just like the Tea Party movement. So your book defines third parties as parties that organize to compete against the two major American political parties. So a lot of times these parties branch out when they feel like the main two parties are not focusing on issues that a lot of people care about, but for whatever reason, it's not been voiced by the major parties. It's not been focused on by the media. But it's something that is actually like it's brewing in the underbelly of society. And a lot of times that's where the third parties pop up, like the Green Party. The Green Party, their main focus is for legalization of marijuana, but they also focus on a lot of climate issues as well. And they talk about it hardcore in a way that the Democratic Party has not always been about, right? Like more people, like on both sides of the aisle, are supportive of legalization of marijuana, but like the Green Party were like the first ones out there saying, toke up, brothers, like let's do the thing, let's like whatever. And so they sort of like led the path on that before other people were comfortable with it. And they're a third party group, and they have maintained a pretty active third party group, just like the Libertarian Party does. But a lot of people who like maybe feel like in agreement with the Green Party, if you look up their voter registration, are they registered Green Party or are they registered Democrat, so they can have a larger voice in our political process since we're a two-party system. Same with libertarians. Like some of them may like really hold true to the convictions, and they're like, I don't like the Democrats or I don't like the Republicans. Like they don't do enough. Like they're not going far enough with it. And so they stick to their convictions. And some people say, well, in a realistic situation, if I want to have a say, I need to be registered one of the two major parties. So, of course, if more people stuck to their guns, maybe we wouldn't have a two-party system. But that's not what is currently happening. So these third parties basically protest against the other major parties, and they push back about what's not being targeted that they feel should be. And it also pushes political parties, like the two major parties, to focus on issues that have been swept under the rug because they're forcing a voice. They're getting out there in front of the media. They're getting enough attention garnered that it can't be ignored by the Democratic or the Republican parties. So for example, in 2000, Ralph Nader ran for office. He actually won 3% of the popular vote. And the people who voted for Ralph Nader, a lot of people have been polled and stuff, and based on what Ralph Nader ran on, like if he hadn't been in the race, those people probably would have voted for Al Gore, which would have been enough to change the election for him to get elected in 2000. But it split the vote between the Democrats and independents. And so it was enough for George Bush to be able to win. So we are in page 232. So now, so we talked about political parties. We're still talking just a smidge about that, and then we're jumping into interest groups. So on page 232, you see this table here, table 8.1, parties and candidates in 2016. So, so this shows you like the two major political parties and then the two large like third party people. So Hillary Clinton was the Democratic candidate, obviously. She won 48% of the vote, but not enough of the Electoral College vote. So she won the popular vote, but not the electoral votes. And we'll be talking about the electoral votes more in chapter 9. And I have a whole video to explain the Electoral College. So just put a pin, like a mental note, if you've got questions about, well, that doesn't make any sense. The video explains it much better than I could ever explain, because the Electoral College is a little convoluted to understand sometimes. And then Donald Trump obviously was the Republican candidate. He got 46% of the votes with 304 electoral college votes, which won him the presidency. Now, you look here, Gary Johnson was a libertarian. So that's a very conservative person, like very like small government, like get it out of the way, whatever. He had almost 4.5 million votes, 3% of the votes split away. You got to wonder who would that 3% have voted for if he wasn't there. And then Jill Stein was the Green Party candidate with almost 1.5 million votes. And that was 1%. And then other candidates that were on the ballot that were third party won a little over 1 million votes, right? Is that right? Million? I'm saying it right. So we just have to go, wait, where's the commas? So if those minor party candidates hadn't have been there, how many of those would have thrown their support for Trump or for Clinton? Would that have been enough to shift the votes to where electoral college votes would have shifted, to where Clinton would have won? You know, like who knows, right? So that can negatively impact like the outcome for the two major parties. So the people who are really involved in the major political parties get really irritated with third party candidates, but it also lends a very important voice that a lot of times would not be heard if just the two major parties dominated the conversation. And if you see here at the bottom, it actually says, as their right, 7 members of the Electoral College voted for other candidates despite Trump or Clinton carrying the state. They take an oath to reflect how the state votes, and that's how the Electoral College votes are supposed to go. But they technically do have a right to cast that particular vote for someone else if they feel like they should as an individual. But a lot of people have issue with that. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the Electoral College in the next chapter. So now we're going to be talking about interest groups. So interest groups are a really important part of the process, one that the average voter a lot of times isn't even aware exists. You know, people know about candidates, they know about elected officials, they know about political parties, they know they need to vote, but a lot of people have no idea that interest groups are even a thing. So, so they're sort of the other side of the coin of importance to getting issues out there. They focus on more specific targeted issues than the political party that has a platform of issues, but their job is to get people elected into office who matches up all those platforms, and then they can work on specific issues. But interest groups more care about an issue or a program more than they care about like an individual. So an interest group is individuals who organize to influence the government's programs and policies. So a lot of times they can be referred to as lobbies or special interests or pressure groups. Sometimes people think that they're what are known as political action committees, but that's totally separate. And we'll talk about that more when we are talking about like the president running for office and stuff. So some interest groups create PACs, which are like the sole purpose of them is to raise money. That's what a PAC is for, raise money for issues or for candidates or for whatever they feel like running, like raising money for. So some interest groups may have their own PAC to raise money for the group, but that is not specifically the interest group. It's like, it's the finance fundraising like arm of the group. So they're different again in the sense that political parties focus on the candidates, interest groups focus on issues. Does that make sense? Let's see. Okay, so we've got different types of interest groups, which you will see questions about, right? So let's see. So the first section that your book talks about are corporate groups and trade associations. Then labor groups, professional associations, and citizen groups. So corporate groups and trade associations are exactly what it sounds like. Businesses largely, right? AT&T, trade associations like American Beverage Association or whatever. But it's all like in kind of the business realm. So let's see. Corporations commonly form trade associations with other businesses in their economic sector, like the American Beverage Association or the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. They may join broader groups as well, like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents many types of businesses, and the National Federation of Independent Businesses, which represents small businesses. So, let's see. So it gives some more little details, which you guys have read the chapter, so I'm not going to bore you with every little piece. So that's the first type of interest group, corporate groups and trade associations. The second one are labor groups, which is exactly what it sounds like, your unions. So you're like your teachers union, for example, like that's what, like when you hear unions, a lot of people are familiar with teachers unions. United Auto Workers, United Mine Workers, Teamsters that lobby on behalf of private sector labor, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. That's the AFSCME one, AFSCME, and the American Federation of Teachers, which is AFT, AFT. Those are all public sector unions that represent members who work in government and public education. Some labor unions, like the Service Employees International Union, organize workers in both public and private sectors. So, so there you go. That's a labor group. And then professional associations: American Bar Association, American Dental Association, American Medical Association. Like all of those, right? Like that's pretty simple, like, and it's all focusing on those efforts. But the largest, like, kind of variety, largest umbrella one that focus more in like a general kumbaya, make the world a better place, is the citizen and public interest groups. So you've got your business groups, your working groups, and then your professional groups. And then you've got like your local groups that focus on things that really, really matter to them. So citizen groups are open to ordinary citizens and provide a wide variety of interests, from environment to abortion to gun policy to disability rights. The largest group is AARP, which you guys should be pretty familiar with. That's the Association, American Association for Retired People, which has 40 million members. Anybody 50 or older can join. National Rifle Association, of course, everybody's familiar with the NRA. The Sierra Club, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's, oh, gracious me. There are a couple, since a lot of the shootings have come out in the last couple of decades, that are sort of like MAD, like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Of course, now I'm blanking on all of them. That are kind of like the opposite of the NRA. Let's see, gun regulation. Let me see if I can find interest groups. Here we go. Let's see. Of course, nothing is coming up. Like, just, oh, Everytown. That's one that I was trying to think of. Everytown is one that does quite a lot. And then there's another one. Sandy Hook Promise is another one. It's the parents of the children who were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School. That was 15 years ago or something. Those kids would be graduated high school now. So I like, there are a lot of groups, but those are two who who do quite a lot, both Everytown and Sandy Hook do. So those are the kind of things that you see in a citizen group or a public interest group. Pro-choice groups, pro-life groups, Christian coalitions, like those are some of the groups that your book kind of references for that. So although public school teachers are a minority of the total population, the unions that represent them are influential interest groups in many states because they are highly informed and a group and act as a group in support of issues related to their profession, including teachers' salaries. So they're a very large, powerful group, really, who get quite a lot done for teachers. So, so those are the different types of groups. If you were to see, you know, like, hey, here's a description of a type of group. What's the name of that group? Is it a citizen group? Is it a professional group? Is it a labor group? You know, what is it? And would you be able to link that? Like, you should understand which group focuses on what, right? So there are benefits to being members of interest groups, to being involved in interest groups. And of course, that varies depending on what the group is as to what benefits are given to members and to the general public. So the first thing that your book talks about is collective goods, benefits sought by groups that are broadly available and cannot be denied to non-members. So the problem is, though, you have what the book refers to as the free rider dilemma, which is simply those who enjoy the benefits of collective goods but do not participate in acquiring or providing them. So people who basically enjoy what they get out of the group, but they don't really put anything back into the group. We all know those people, right? Like, you know, like the person who's assigned like a group project, like, and like 3 people in the group are doing their work and then the one person isn't, and the other 3 people just don't really like have the time or the heart to like throw them under the bus so they get a good grade along with the other 3 people who actually did the work. Like that. That's a free rider. So an example that your book gives is polluted air. Groups that help defeat pollution benefit everybody, whether you actually participate in these groups or not, or do anything for the environment or not. Everybody benefits from cleaner air, whether you were part of that conversation or that work effort or not. So, so there's the collective goods that everybody benefits from, like cleaner air, right? But how do you get over the fact that there are those people who just show up for the brownies and the coffee at the meeting, but they don't do anything, right? So there are additional benefits that interest groups implement to entice you to be involved, like really involved, like actually do the work, call a legislator, attend a rally, you know, bring the donuts to the meeting the next time, whatever. So the first benefit that your book talks about is informational benefits, special newsletters, periodicals, training programs, conferences, and other information provided to members or of groups to entice others to join. So like, ooh, hey, here's some nice information for you. Like, you want to know more about the work that we do. You want to know more about how like this work benefits, like whatever, saving the whales or whatnot. Like, here's some information on it. So that's an informational benefit, and you have to sign up or you have to pay the membership dues or whatever to be on the email list or the whatnot to get that. Or if you want to go to the annual conference, you got to like pay the membership due or whatever the situation is. And then there's material benefits, which are special goods, services, or money provided to members or groups to entice others to join. So for example, this can be anything like gifts like tote bags and mugs. We all love free crap, right? Discounts on travel, which if you're a member of the AARP, they offer discounts on travel. They give you deals on hotels and car rentals and, oh, like, hey, you can get better car insurance. Like we've got like a deal through such and such company or whatever. Let's see, health and retirement insurance by professional associations, that kind of thing. And then there's solidarity benefits, which are selective benefits of group membership that emphasize friendship, networking, and consciousness raising. So that's literally like, it gives you the benefit of networking and coming together with other people of like minds who have common goals. For some people, like that is a very substantial thing, because sometimes it's easy to feel like you're the only person who cares about a particular issue in the world, and then you find other people who also care, and it's like, oh, I'm not crazy. like, or if I am, we're all crazy. Like we all think this is important enough to like get up in arms about. And then purposive benefits, which are selective benefits of group membership that emphasize the purpose and accomplishments of the group. So that's like trade associations to further your economic interests, consumer, environmental, and civic groups to pursue goals important to them, like government reform, civil rights, economic equality, family values, or even opposition to government itself. Are some of the most successful interest groups. So those are all different types of benefits that you can get from being involved in an interest group. And those things help take care of the free rider problem. So yeah, okay, we solve world hunger, like that benefits everybody and everybody feels good and whatever, but like here are some additional benefits if you donated every month to the whatever fund to feed everybody, or like clean water everywhere, because believe it or not, there are places that don't they don't have clean water, and they still drink water that has bacteria and like worms and like things that can actually make people very, very ill. And then there are these massive programs that help provide clean water to like all corners of the world, because without clean water, there's like little other you can do. Like it contaminates your food, like you can't bathe properly, like you can't sterilize things, like it's endless what not having clean water limits the ability for an individual to do. So this table on page 238 gives you a breakdown of those things if you like need that visual as opposed to like reading it out in paragraph form. So that's helpful for you guys. So different interest groups focus on different things, right? And they all have different goals in mind. Now, there are some interest groups that are not necessarily represented. So your book talks about the theory of pluralism, which is that all interests are and should be free to compete for influence in the government. It was a long dominant view of the US political system. However, critics point out that not all interests are equally represented in debates over government and policy. Some of them speak with loud voices, large corporations, for example, because again, money talks and they've got money, while others can barely make themselves heard, the homeless, for example. Pluralism does not guarantee political equality. Research indicates, though, through group politics, economic elites have considerably more influence than mass forces. This version of pluralism is called elite pluralism and more accurately describes American politics, because a lot of those people try to provide a voice for the voiceless. So as political scientist E.E. Schachtschneider, I think I said that right, put it, the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper class accent. I love that quote. His point was that interest group politics is heavily skewed in favor of corporate, business, and upper class groups, leaving those with lower socioeconomic status less able to participate in and influence government. The central reason for this skew is that people with higher incomes, more education, and managerial or professional occupations are more likely to have the time, money, and skills needed to play a role in a group or contribute financially to it, which we've talked about in previous lectures, right? So we are almost there, guys. So close, so close. I can see it. So, all right, so we are on page 240 now. So we've just got a couple more pages to go. So what do interest groups do? So now we are on the chapter goal of explain how interest groups try to influence government and policy. That is actually also the last chapter goal. So we're in the home stretch, guys. So interest groups try to make their voices heard for what it is that they're organized for, what it is they care about, saving the trees, the whales, the air, whatever, right? And they try to do that by connecting to the government and the elected officials and getting them to care about the issues. So the way they do that is through something called lobbying. So lobbying is a strategy by which organized interests seek to influence the passage of legislation by exerting direct pressure on government officials. So they do that through several things: face-to-face contact with the legislators themselves, or top staff members in private, a lot of negotiations. Hey, like, you know, did you know that your constituents care about this issue? And here's why. Here's the facts about it. Because the simple fact of the matter is that an elected official doesn't know everything. And not even their staff is going to have all the answers to everything. Interest groups actually provide a valuable wealth of information to legislators, to lawmakers, because like like you can't hire somebody to know every single little thing, right? Like, and that's where interest groups help, because they can bring that information in front of the legislators and say, this matters. Here's why it matters. Here's some facts like from your constituents in your area. Like so and so many were polled X, Y, and Z, and they all care about this, and they're all voters and yada, 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 right? Like, here's why you need to care about it. Here's why you need to take action on it and do something to make that issue better. And so they do that through lobbying. They provide information to the staff, to the legislators, to administrators, so that way they're aware of the issue. They will even provide testimony in front of congressional committees that are formed when they're working on legislation about particular issues. If there's an interest group that like falls in that realm of that congressional committee, they can testify before them and to give them that same kind of information. They organize phone calls, emails, social media blasts, letter writing, rallies, like even sit-ins at times, ways to basically get the legislators' attention. Like, okay, everybody's going to show up to Representative, Joe's office, and we're all going to drop off like a letter saying how we feel about this situation. We're going to inundate them with phone calls. We're going to send them emails. We're going to get the word out on our social media accounts that this issue matters and that you need to care about it and you need to take action on it as well. So those are all ways that they lobby the legislators to actually do something about whatever it is their interest group is built on. So on page 240, it also shows this figure 8.4, which is how interest groups influence Congress. So I won't read this like verbatim, but it kind of shows you how the process works. So so you start out in an interest group and maybe they contact the constituents, like they contact other voters. Hey, like this influences you. Did you know that? And here's how it influences you. Do you know like your job could be cut, like if this situation passed? So then they push the constituents to reach out to their elected officials. So now the elected officials have been contacted. So, and then the interest group also directly contacts the members of Congress, and they reach out to other members who have alliances with the people they're actually targeting who can make a difference and vote on it. And so now they're getting inundated that way. They also reach out to the congressional staff who lets the targeted congressional members know. Interest groups also reach out to the media. The media also reaches out to the target members. So you see they come at the legislators that they're targeting to vote for a particular issue in multiple formats to inundate them with it so that they're hearing not just from the interest group, but from the voters and from their fellow legislators and from the media, all the same message about things mattering. So then they'll go, ooh, I really do need to pay attention to this. Like everybody is talking about this. So, so that is how they influence Congress to do that. So, so it is not just Congress that they lobby, they also lobby the president, directly and indirectly. Only the most skilled, the people who've been doing it for a hot minute, can successfully lobby the president. Like that's not something like some, you know, first day lobbyists is be able to do it. They have to be very well connected. They have to really be engaged in the process and have been for a while to be able to get FaceTime with the president or their senior staff. So let's see. You can also lobby the executive branch, which your slide shows you here. They can reach out to Congress. They can reach out to so, you know, the legislative branch is Congress, the judicial branch is Supreme Court, and the executive branch is presidency. So it's not just the president, it can be like their senior staff, people on their cabinet, like they can take different ways to reach the president to talk about particular issues to try and get things done as well. So business owners are often able to gain special access to elected officials. Here you see President Trump holding a roundtable discussion with small business owners from across the country. So there are two different types of groups as to how interest groups and elected officials and members of cabinets and stuff kind of all come together to really get things done. So the first one is an iron triangle. The definition of that is the stable cooperative relationship that often develops among a congressional committee, an administrative agency, and one or more supportive interest groups. Not all of these relationships are triangular, but the iron triangle is the most typical. So for example, interest groups can provide campaign contributions to people in Congress and lobby for larger agency budgets for issues that directly impact the interest group, right? So you can create like that PAC, that fundraising arm, donate to certain people in Congress who will support the interest group's agenda, and then that congressional member can then do things that help the interest group. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Government agencies can also provide government contracts that are helpful for interest groups and members of Congress, like, you know, I don't know, like banning offshore drilling or whatever, like whatever it happens to be, like they can kind of work together to make that happen because the interest group supported them. And the members of Congress can provide larger budgets for the particular group, and then policies that favor the interest group, like banning offshore drilling if they're looking for protecting, you know, Panama City beaches or something, or, you know, making sure that the emission standards for air pollution are not exceeded and whatnot. Like they can focus efforts on that to help support those interest groups, because those interest groups also supported those legislators. Okay. So some areas are not considered to be an iron triangle, but instead they're listed as an issue network. So an issue network is a loose network of elected officials, public officials, activists, and interest groups drawn together by a specific policy issue. So not like kind of a broader long-term game, but like, hey, there's this one particular issue that matters to us. So, so let's see if your book has an example of that. It doesn't. But your book does say that both the iron triangle and issue networks can coexist. Some issue networks have iron triangles at their core. For example, iron triangles can be at the center of many areas of energy policy, but sometimes a high profile proposal, such as a new interstate pipeline, activates a broader issue network, including landowners, environmentalists, state officials, and so on, to handle that one particular issue. So hopefully that makes sense. So figure 8.5 is on page 243. So this will give you some examples of iron triangles, like the three groups that come together to get things done. So that way you have a visual should you need it. So, so in addition to using lobbying and iron triangles and issue networks, interest groups also go through the court system when necessary to focus on their what's the word? It's right there. Their mission statement. So certain things that they do bring lawsuits directly on behalf of the group itself. You know, like Sierra Club versus the United States, whatever. Financing suits brought by individuals. So like, okay, there's an individual suing based on, you know, like the lake behind their house was used as an illegal dumping ground. And so they reach out to like an environmental interest group or whatever, and they help provide like the legal fees for that individual to sue, you know, whoever did the illegal dumping. And then another thing is filing an amicus curiae, which I don't think I ever say that right, which is a brief to an existing court case. So that's Latin for friend of the court. So it's basically supporting a court case that might already be out and giving like supplemental information to help with the case if it impacts what that interest group is about. So your book gave an example. Among the best known examples of using courts for political influence is the litigation of the NAACP that led to Brown v. Board of Education, which we have discussed in the civil liberties and civil rights chapters, where the Supreme Court held that legal segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. Later extensive litigation accompanied the women's rights movement in the 60s and the movement for rights of gays and lesbians in the 90s. So those are groups where, so like the NAACP would be like an interest group, and they help support like the Brown family in that lawsuit, right? So a lot of groups like the NAACP, the ACLU, those sort of groups regularly use the litigation tactic for their interests. So to be a successful interest group, you need a couple of things. You need to have good, solid leadership, right? That makes sense. Like all groups fall apart if they don't have like effective leaders to like stay the course and keep focus. A lot of resources, whether that be a lot of members to do legwork or have a lot of money. Kudos if you got both. And you need to have staff who know what in the world they're talking about to do an effective job of representing the interests that you care about and to actually get things done. A lot of scholars think that these can buy access to government officials and to the legal process, or I'm sorry, the legislative process. But influence, which is actually getting a member of government to do something they otherwise wouldn't, is a rarer situation. So it might bring more awareness to a matter, but it might not actually change a government official's mind from like a no to like a hard no to a hard yes, you know, so, you know, kind of back and forth. So let's see. So your book talks about influence, and some of that depends on interest group. Like NAACP is largely influential and effective, same with ACLU. So there are regulations for lobbying legislators. The Obama administration tried to strengthen some things, like you can't like go right into lobbying after having, been an elected official or something. You've got to wait so long um, to kind of level the playing field because DC has such a high turnover. Um, Maybe not all of your contacts are still around. It makes the game a little harder, I guess. So here's one instance that your book talks about where Congress tried to regulate lobbying. One of those cases where they tried to do that was the Jack Abramoff scandal in 2005. So the Jack Abramoff scandal in 2005 is listed on your page 245, regulating lobbying. So a prominent Washington lobbyist, Abramoff, was convicted of fraud and violations of federal lobbying laws. He had collected tens of millions of dollars from several American Indian tribes that had operated lucrative gambling casinos. Much of this money found its way into the campaign war chests of his friends in Congress, including former Majority Leader Tom DeLay. So obviously that was a huge deal. So as a result, some new regulations were implemented, including the fact that businesses can no longer deduct lobbying costs as a business expense. They have to actually report it properly as a lobbying expense. Trade associations have to report to members the portion of what their dues are actually spent on lobbying. They can't like bury it in their reports. And the size and types of gifts are also limited. They can't give large, extravagant things, take them out for a multi-$100 fancy dinner and shower them with gifts to basically buy their votes. So that was a result of this scandal that occurred. So there are a lot of regulations now in place to make sure that the political process isn't impugned by this sort of thing. So that is the end of chapter 8. Woohoo, another chapter down. We're getting it, guys. So as always, feel free to read the what do you think section at the end to sort of like link it to some real world examples. And of course, your study guide on pages 247 through 249. These are very helpful practice quizzes and key terms to review, plus the study guide that I give you for each of the exams. But this helps break it down for this particular chapter. So as you're kind of studying each section before you take the exam, this is a good way to do that. So we're going to do the public opinion poll really quickly. Should the Democratic and Republican parties have a national primary instead of a state-by-state system to select their party's presidential nominees? A lot of people have felt like if we just did one national primary, instead of dragging it out for months, state to state to state, it would smooth things along, move things along the process. The downside is because we are a 50-state union, if we did it that way, we would have to have the primary later, right? So it wouldn't give as much time for the national campaigns to campaign, really, before the general election. You wouldn't have as much time with who the final two candidates would be, because they would have to like kind of move it to a regular August primary and then have the general in November, which isn't as a big deal for your local and your state races because they're not campaigning on such a large scale. But the presidency is running for the entire nation. So they have to have time to campaign in those states, reach out to each of those states, build a strategy that works across the nation. And that simply takes time. And each state is different. And so they have to address the needs of each state and focus on what's important in those areas. And it's harder to build an effective campaign at a national level. And it's so many people, like it takes so much time to fundraise to be able to travel across the nation. Just like logistically, it's not, with our current voting system and the presidential preference versus like a national, and because we do have 50 states to have to be campaigned at. Like logistically isn't logical. It's just not like a great plan. But it, like if we didn't have states, it might be different. Do you think more people would vote if there were more viable political parties, like 3 to 5 instead of only 2 as we have now? Obviously that's subjective for what you feel. I actually don't think it would matter. I think it would either be B or C. I think it would more likely be B because we've had other parties. We do have other political parties. But just the way we all kind of the way our history has moved, we've always just naturally consolidated into like a 2-party system. And other parties have just kind of continually gotten absolved into the larger parties. So I just don't know that it would make a difference because the people who want to vote third party do. And those who don't. And possibly would cause confusion for folks. So I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine considering we haven't had it that way at all, literally in the history of our country. So I'm not really sure that it would be any more effective. Do you think there's a significant difference between Democrats and Republicans in office? Obviously, that is subjective for you to answer. A lot of people think, no, all politicians are the same. And then a lot of people say no, like it's very different based on their personal values and beliefs. So I'm not going to give you my particular opinion on that. I think that one's one that's best left for you to think about. Do you think turnout rates would increase if all elections were nonpartisan, like a lot of local elections? In other words, there's not a D or an R next to their name, like they just run on their issues and it's got their name, but no political party. Yes, people would like to vote for people not associated with the party. No, people would be confused without party cues to help them make their voter choice. I think that depends on the individual, but at the end of the day, people say that they don't, but more people vote party lines than not because it helps people to sort of understand as a general, like, okay, well, I know the Democratic Party has these political values, the Republican Party has these political values, and by you being registered one or the other, that helps me have a general idea of where you stand. And now I just have to listen for the specifics to see how I feel about you. So I don't think that it would be better. And a lot of that is also from my experience in seeing how nonpartisan races go. People tend to not vote for them as much as they do the political parties because people are lazy and it would require more research. So I kind of think we would have actually like less turnout because a lot of people aren't going to take the time to do the homework on the candidates. And that's just a sad fact. Number 5, do you think it's appropriate for colleges and universities to lobby local, state, and federal governments? They do, by the way, like we didn't really talk about that in the lecture, but they do lobby for funding for things, for issues that affect their students and that kind of thing. So that's subjective for you, but it's part of our political process. So it just is. Are elected officials and candidates influenced more by the concerns of interest groups or voters? So if you remember, it talks about how they might be able to provide some insight to things, but not nearly as much influence as the voters themselves. So voter concerns are more influential, but interest groups help provide sort of a group voice for what certain voters are concerned about. So it is still important, but not quite as important as voters individually, because interest groups don't vote. They do provide money, but they don't grow, like the group doesn't vote, just the individuals, right? Number 7, is it a good thing that interest groups representing views similar to your own, like internet privacy, liberal or conservative causes, lobby elected officials? Yes, it's a good thing that interest groups lobby on issues and positions similar to my own, or no. That's subjective, obviously, for you. I mean, I think personally, yes, because, individuals have lives and the average person doesn't have or take the time to basically lobby for their own self-interest. And these groups kind of do that on our behalf. So I do think it's important because it gives larger voice to issues that people care about. Number 8, should former elected officials be banned from lobbying their former colleagues, like members of Congress, or would such a ban impose on their personal freedom and liberty? So they are banned for a short period of time. I think it's 6 months or a year or something, maybe a little bit longer than that. I have to look it up. But not like forever. So it's kind of a little bit of both. Like it's a temporary ban, but it's not like a forever ban. So, but that's subjective again as to how you would feel about it. Okay. So of course, the America side by side is always nice, comparing party systems. So this shows you other areas, like this is Mexico, this is the Netherlands, and then it shows you how their political parties work. As you can see, they have standout groups as well, just like us. They have multiple systems, but if you look, like there are definitely standout groups, and then like maybe a couple of like others, and then little piddly groups. So to me, this feels more confusing, but perhaps just because this is the only system I've ever voted in. Maybe this looks absurd to the Netherlands and Mexico. I'm sure it does. So this is in the middle of your chapter. And so if you're passionate about something and you don't find an interest group or an advocacy group that you feel reflects something that like your gut, your passion, your soul, whatever you believe, whatever like your gut deep down inside is telling you, like more has to be done about this. This is so important. It keeps me up at night, and you don't find anything that kind of fits along with that. This is a really great how-to on how to start an advocacy group. And if you do find groups like that, and it is something that you're that passionate about, then by all means, you should get involved with those groups and be part of that process for sure. So this is really interesting. So figure out what you're passionate about and get educated about that issue. Decide on the scope and goal and the objective that you're trying to accomplish. Think about the people you need around you to be successful in your goals. Figure out your group's branding, the look and feel, name, logo, font, colors, and then keep going even when you face defeat. So this is the woman who created Moms Against, or Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. So she was a stay-at-home mom. And then when Newtown happened, she just felt like she had to do something. Like as a mother, she needed to stand out and stand up for children being impacted by these mass shootings. So she did. So this is like a really great how-to on ways to get involved. And then realize that change is usually in smaller steps. Like you want to change the world, but it usually is baby step by baby step to get things done, which can be frustrating, but any change towards your goal in a positive way is progress, right? So here's some images from a rally that they did. So that is chapter 8. So we're totally done with that. Woohoo! So, so of course, as always, if you have any questions, let me know. If you don't understand something, or you just need whatever to like reach out, like I'm always available. Like I check my email every single day, usually multiple times a day. Your fellow classmates who have reached out to me for things can definitely verify that. Like I'm usually pretty prompt about responding to stuff and back and forth communication. So definitely let me know if you need anything at all. And the next time we chat, we'll be talking about chapter 9. So we'll talk soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.